Here is the story of the adventures of Emily's cat, Mouton. Long before television, before telephones sat on tables, and before children watched moving pictures, a young girl named Emily Mary Madden created a world of her own. Emily did not write about kings or knights. She wrote about someone far more important, her beloved cat, Mouton. In Emily's imagination, Mouton was never an ordinary cat. He was an explorer, a gentleman, a traveller, and occasionally a bit of a troublemaker. Mouton looked up in quiet surprise. Standing before him was a gentle elephant whose kind eyes seemed to hold 1,000 secrets. The little creature watched him carefully, as though wondering where he had come from and why he had suddenly appeared. Mouton watched him just as closely. For a moment neither moved. Both seemed to be deciding whether a friendship had just begun. As Mouton stood beside his curious new companion, the world around him suddenly began to change. The room faded, colours swirled, and before he could make sense of any of it, he found himself standing before a princess. Mouton stepped forward with all the dignity he could possibly gather. The princess watched him with a warm and welcoming smile. He lifted his head proudly and presented himself as though he had practiced for this very moment his entire life. Though deep inside, Mouton still had the small suspicion that he had absolutely no idea what he was doing. No sooner had Mouton presented himself before the princess than music began drifting through the room. The grand hall seemed to come alive around him. Tiny musicians played cheerful melodies, and elegant guests twirled beneath the warm glow of the lights. Before Mouton had time to understand any of it, a charming little mouse stepped forward, took his paws and swept him into the dance. For a moment, Mouton forgot all about questions, confusion, and strange new worlds. He simply danced. As the music faded and the dancers disappeared, Emily's imagination opened another curious little world. In a room filled with books and strange wonders, a tiny mouse stood proudly beside a chalkboard, teaching with tremendous importance. A patient frog listened carefully from his chair, as though every lesson contained the secrets of the universe. Whether anyone truly understood the lesson remained something of a mystery. As the lesson came to an end, the classroom slowly faded away. Mouton blinked once. Now he found himself beside a cheerful old storyteller whose eyes sparkled as though he knew every secret hidden in the world. Books surrounded them from every direction. Mouton sat quietly and listened. He had begun to suspect that every new place had a story waiting for him. The books faded. Golden sparks danced through the air. Suddenly, Mouton found himself racing through misty city streets atop a determined policeman. A woman leaned from her window in astonishment. Mouton remained perfectly calm. At this point, he had begun to suspect that almost anything was possible. No sooner had Mouton adjusted to the strange city streets than the world transformed once again. Bright lights appeared. Music echoed through the air. Suddenly, Mouton found himself soaring high above a galloping horse, while a very serious pig announced the performance with tremendous enthusiasm. The crowd burst into applause. Mouton remained perfectly composed. After all, if one intended to fly through the air, one ought to do it with dignity. The performance only seemed to grow stranger. Round and round Mouton soared, as music and laughter filled the air around him. Animals hurried in every direction, each one appearing perfectly comfortable with the delightful chaos unfolding around them. Mouton had long since stopped trying to understand how he had arrived there. For now, he simply lifted his chin, held on tightly, and enjoyed the ride. As the circus lights slowly faded, Mouton found himself once again in a room filled with curious little wonders. Above him, a dark and menacing bat swept through the air, its wings stretching across the shadows as though it were guarding some hidden secret. Mouton watched carefully. Then suddenly, as if the room itself had been waiting for the perfect moment, something appeared before him. Mouton leaned closer. As Mouton leaned closer to examine his newest discovery, he noticed something rather unusual. The tiny mice stared back at him with complete calmness, as though they had been expecting his arrival. Mouton raised his paw carefully and studied them in silence. He had spent much of his journey meeting strange creatures. Being studied in return felt entirely different. No sooner had Mouton finished studying the tiny mice than the world changed once again. The shadows disappeared, and warm sunlight spilled across the countryside. Now Mouton found himself riding upon the back of a faithful companion, racing along woodland paths with the wind at his whiskers. Before Mouton had time to catch his breath, another curious scene unfolded before him. Two brave warriors stepped forward and crossed their swords with tremendous determination. Clash after clash rang through the room as sparks flew through the air. Mouton sat perfectly still and watched with great seriousness. He had never attended a duel before, though he felt quite certain he looked exactly like someone who had. No sooner had the duel come to an end than music once again filled the air. Grand chandeliers glowed overhead as guests twirled across the polished floor in beautiful gowns and fine coats. Without warning, Mouton found himself swept into the celebration. Round and round they danced beneath the golden lights. By now, Mouton had stopped asking how these things happened. As the music swelled and the performers gathered around him, Mouton suddenly realized something rather extraordinary. He was no longer simply watching the adventure unfold. He had become part of it. Surrounded by musicians and marvelous little companions, Mouton sat proudly at the very center of it all. For a moment, everything felt perfectly right, and Mouton could not help thinking that perhaps this strange and wonderful world had been waiting for him all along. As the music and celebration faded into the distance, Mouton suddenly found himself face to face with a most troublesome creature. Its strange eyes watched him carefully from the shadows. For a brief moment, neither moved. Then, without warning, Mouton sprang forward with all the courage he could gather. He had faced princesses, elephants, dancing mice, and worlds that changed without reason. He certainly was not about to be frightened now. As the last of the shadows disappeared, Mouton discovered that the world had changed once again. Sunlight spilled through the trees, and music drifted softly through the forest air. Surrounded by old friends and curious companions, Mouton found himself seated at the center of a most unusual little orchestra. A horse stood nearby. An elephant watched quietly. Tiny musicians played with tremendous importance. No sooner had the music faded than Mouton found himself racing across the countryside once again. Only this time, his noble steed was unlike any creature he had ever seen. With dust flying behind them and the wind rushing through his whiskers, Mouton lifted his wand high into the air and rode forward with tremendous determination. Where they were going remained a mystery, but Mouton had discovered that the most extraordinary journeys rarely begin in ordinary ways. No sooner had Mouton ridden out of the countryside than he found himself facing yet another curious opponent. Standing before him was a strange bird dressed with tremendous importance and carrying a tiny sword of its own. Steel met steel, and sparks danced through the air between them. Mouton stood his ground bravely. He had begun to learn that in this strange little world, one never knew who might ask for a duel. As the battle finally came to an end, Mouton stood proudly upon his defeated opponent. The great rat lay beneath him while Mouton lifted his head with all the confidence of a victorious hero. For a moment, the world seemed perfectly still. Mouton had never imagined himself